A man died in 1608, and we're still arguing about whether he was talking to angels or demons, not whether the conversations happened, whether the beings on the other end were divine messengers or something darker. That distinction mattered to John Dee more than anything, and it should matter to us too, because this wasn't some village conjurer muttering spells in a basement. This was Queen Elizabeth's most trusted advisor, the man who chose the date of her coronation by reading the stars, the mathematician who trained England's greatest navigators, spending years conversing with entities that dictated entire books in languages no human had ever spoken. And here's what makes it stranger. He kept detailed records, thousands of pages documenting exactly what these beings said, how they appeared, what they demanded. We have his journals, we have the obsidian mirror he used, we have the angelic alphabet they supposedly revealed. The evidence exists, but the interpretation remains impossible. John Dee was born into a London most people wouldn't recognise. July 13th, 1527. Tower Ward, near the docks where the Thames brought ships from everywhere that mattered. His father, Roland, was a mercer and gentleman sewer to Henry VIII. That meant textiles, clothing for the royal household, proximity to power without actually possessing any. His mother, Jane Wilde, was 15 when she married Roland, 18 when John arrived, their only child. The surname Dee came from the Welsh du, meaning black. His grandfather, Baedo Du, had lived in Radnorshire, and John would later trace his lineage back to Rhodri the Great, a 9th century Welsh ruler. Whether that genealogy was accurate or aspirational is debatable. What matters is that Dee believed it, constructed a pedigree accordingly, and used it to establish himself as more than a mercer's son. The young John experienced two worlds. Tower Ward was chaos. Sailors, merchants, languages colliding in cramped streets that smelled of fish and tar and worse. Then there was Greenwich Palace, where his father worked, all order and hierarchy and stone. One world dealt in survival, the other in ceremony. Dee learned to navigate both, a skill that would define his entire life. He'd spend decades moving between queen's courts and alchemists' laboratories, between mathematical lectures and conversations with angels, never quite belonging to either realm, but essential to both. At 8 years old, he was sent to Chelmsford Chantry School. 7 years there, learning the basics expected of a merchant's son. Reading, writing, enough Latin to handle contracts and correspondence. Nothing exceptional yet. But something was happening in that boy's mind. A hunger for knowledge that would become almost pathological. In November 1542, aged 15, he entered St. John's College, Cambridge. And that's where the transformation began. Cambridge in the 1540s was intellectual ferment mixed with religious paranoia. Henry VIII had broken with Rome. The monasteries were being dissolved. Ancient libraries were being scattered or destroyed. Dee arrived in the middle of this chaos and somehow thrived. He studied Greek, Latin, philosophy, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy. The standard curriculum, but he approached it with unusual intensity. 18 hours a day devoted to study, 4 hours for sleep, 2 for meals. Every biographer mentions these numbers because Dee himself emphasized them. Whether they're literally accurate doesn't matter. The point is how he wanted to be seen, as someone so consumed by learning that normal human needs became secondary. Mathematics became his obsession, not just arithmetic for accounting or geometry for surveying. Mathematics as a way of understanding divine structure, as a language connecting earthly matter to celestial perfection. This wasn't unusual for the period. Pythagorean mysticism had been rediscovered. Scholars were finding ancient texts that suggested numbers held magical properties, that mathematical ratios governed everything from music to the motion of planets. Dee absorbed it all, seeing no contradiction between calculating trajectories and seeking spiritual truth through numerical patterns. He graduated with his BA in 1545 or early 1546. Then something remarkable happened. Trinity College was founded by Henry VIII in 1546, and Dee became an original fellow, one of the first scholars appointed to this new institution. He was 19 years old, and he was given resources, time, access to other brilliant minds. But what secured his early reputation had nothing to do with academic papers. Trinity decided to stage Aristophanes' piece, a Greek comedy involving a character flying up to heaven on a giant dung beetle. Ambitious for a university production, they asked Dee to design the stage effects. He created a mechanical contrivance using pulleys and mirrors that made the actor appear to fly, ascending toward Jupiter's palace in what must have been a startling illusion for 16th century audiences. The performance was successful. People talked about it, and they started calling Dee a magician. He would later claim this was the beginning of his reputation for sorcery, that people saw sophisticated engineering and assumed supernatural intervention. There's truth to that, but it's also convenient. Dee spent his entire career walking a line between natural philosophy and occult practices, and he knew the value of ambiguity. If people thought he possessed special powers, that made him more valuable to potential patrons. If authorities accused him of witchcraft, he could point to mechanical explanations and mathematical principles. The flying beetle was perfect, impressive enough to generate mystique, explicable enough to avoid prosecution. In 1547, he left England for the continent. First visit was brief, just testing the waters. Then from 1548 to 1551, he stayed in the Low Countries, studying under the best mathematical minds in Europe. This is where Dee's education became world-class. He apprenticed with Gemma Frisius, a Dutch mathematician, cartographer, and instrument maker, whose work was revolutionizing navigation. He became close friends with Gerardus Mercator, whose map projection would define how Europeans visualized the world for centuries. He studied with Pedro Núñez and Abraham Ortelius. These weren't just academics, they were men whose work had immediate, practical applications. Their maps guided ships, their instruments measured stars. Their calculations determined whether expeditions succeeded or failed. Dee returned to England with a collection of mathematical and astronomical instruments that would become the envy of every scholar in the country. He had the latest technology, the best training, connections to the most advanced thinkers in Europe. And he was still in his early 20s. The University of Paris invited him to lecture on Euclidean geometry. Lecture halls overflowed. Students stood in doorways trying to hear. This wasn't normal. Geometry lectures didn't draw crowds. But Dee had a gift for making abstract mathematics seem urgent, relevant, connected to larger questions about the structure of reality. Paris offered him a professorship. He turned it down. Oxford made a similar offer in 1554. He refused that too. Why? Because he wanted something better. An official position with the English crown. Court mathematician. Royal advisor. The kind of role that would give him security, resources, and influence. So he returned to England and attached himself to the royal court, offering instruction to courtiers and navigators, making himself indispensable. This is where timing became everything, because England in the 1550s was dangerous for someone like Dee. Henry VIII was dead. His son Edward VI had ruled briefly, pushing Protestant reforms, then died young. Now Mary sat on the throne, determined to return England to Catholicism. The burnings began. Heretics, Protestants, anyone who resisted the old faith. 300 people would die during Mary's 5-year reign. And in 1555, John Dee found himself arrested. The charges were witchcraft. He had cast horoscopes for Queen Mary and her younger sister, Princess Elizabeth. That alone was dangerous. Astrology was acceptable when it praised the monarch, treasonous when it might predict their downfall. But the accusations went further. Plots against Mary's life, using magic to harm the Queen. These were capital offences. Dee was interrogated in the Star Chamber, an English court that sat in Westminster, where procedures favoured the Crown and the accused had few protections. He was eventually exonerated by common law judges. The evidence was too thin, the charges too obviously political, but then he faced examination by Bishop Bonner, the heretic hunter whose cruelty had earned him the nickname Bloody Bonner. This should have been the end. Bonner burned people for less than what Dee was accused of. Instead, something strange happened. Dee made Bonner a close associate and friend. How he accomplished this isn't entirely clear from surviving records. Perhaps he demonstrated his religious orthodoxy convincingly. Perhaps he had information Bonner wanted. Perhaps he simply recognised that befriending the most dangerous man in England was better than opposing him. Whatever the method, it worked. Dee became Bonner's chaplain. He participated in interrogations of Protestant prisoners. He debated theology in ways that pleased his patron. This was survival, pure calculation. When the political winds shifted, as Dee knew they would, he'd adjust accordingly. For now, he stayed alive by appearing to be exactly what Bonner wanted him to be. In 1556, Dee presented Queen Mary with a proposal: establish a national library, preserve old books, manuscripts, and records that were being lost in the chaos of religious upheaval. It was a visionary plan, genuinely concerned with saving knowledge. It was also politically astute. Mary was trying to restore Catholic learning. A royal library would serve that purpose while giving Dee official status and resources. But Mary didn't take the proposal seriously, so Dee expanded his personal library in Mortlake instead, acquiring books and manuscripts wherever he could find them. If England wouldn't preserve its intellectual heritage, he would. Then Mary died, November 17th, 1558. Her younger sister Elizabeth succeeded to the throne, and everything changed for John Dee. Elizabeth was 25 years old, unmarried, facing a country torn apart by religious conflict and a court full of people who doubted a woman could rule effectively. She needed advisors she could trust. Dee had known her before she became queen, had cast horoscopes for her that predicted her eventual succession. Now he became her astrological and scientific advisor. She asked him to choose an auspicious date for her coronation. This was his first major service to the new queen. He calculated, consulted the stars, and determined that January 15th, 1559 offered the most favourable celestial alignment. Whether the stars actually mattered is irrelevant. What mattered was that Elizabeth believed they mattered, or at least recognised that her subjects believed they mattered. The coronation happened on Dee's chosen date, and it was magnificent. Elizabeth began her reign under astrologically approved circumstances, and Dee's position was secured. He became a Protestant. Officially, publicly, completely. Was this sincere conversion or calculated adaptation? Dee had been Bonner's chaplain, defending Catholic doctrine just years earlier. Now he embraced the Reformed faith with equal enthusiasm. Perhaps he'd always been Protestant at heart, hiding his true beliefs under Mary. Perhaps he genuinely changed his mind. Or perhaps Dee's actual religious convictions were more complicated than simple Catholic versus Protestant categories, and he simply aligned with whatever faction held power. The third option seems most likely. Dee believed in God, believed in angels, believed in divine order. But his relationship with Christianity was filtered through Hermetic philosophy, Neoplatonism, and Kabbalah. He was Christian the way a quantum physicist is a materialist. Technically accurate, but missing crucial nuances. Elizabeth relied on Dee for more than astrology. He advised on mathematics, chemistry, astronomy, geography, navigation. He tutored her ministers: Francis Walsingham, William Cecil, Robert Dudley. He taught Sir Philip Sidney. These weren't casual relationships. Dee was embedded in the highest levels of Elizabethan politics, trusted with sensitive information, consulted on matters of state, and all the while he was building something unprecedented. A private library that would become the greatest in England, assembled at enormous personal expense, containing virtually every aspect of classical, medieval, and Renaissance learning. The Mortlake Library would eventually hold 3,000 to 4,000 volumes. In a country where university libraries struggled to maintain 1,000 books, where most private collections consisted of a few dozen volumes, Dee had created a research institution that rivaled anything in Europe. Scholars travelled from across England to consult his books. Students came seeking instruction. The library became a centre of learning outside the university system, free from institutional restrictions, open to anyone Dee deemed worthy. He was creating his own academy, building the intellectual infrastructure England lacked, but maintaining this required money, constant, substantial funding. Books were expensive, instruments were expensive. The building itself, the staff, the time Dee needed to study rather than work for income, all of it required resources he didn't have. Patronage helped, royal appointments provided some income, but it was never enough. Dee would spend his entire life scrambling for financial security, accepting positions he didn't want, pursuing schemes that promised wealth but delivered disappointment. The library was both his greatest achievement and a financial millstone that would eventually drag him into decisions that destroyed his reputation. That destruction was still decades away. For now, in the early years of Elizabeth's reign, John Dee stood at the centre of English intellectual life. Trusted advisor to the Queen, owner of the nation's finest library, mathematician, astronomer, geographer, he had achieved what he'd been working towards since Cambridge: recognition, influence, security. He was 40 years old, and his career was reaching its apex. What came next would either cement his legacy as one of England's greatest scholars, or reduce him to a cautionary tale about the dangers of occult obsession. The angels hadn't started talking yet. That conversation was about to begin, and when it did, everything would change. But first Dee had work to do. England was expanding its reach, sending ships into unknown waters, claiming territories on the other side of the world. And the man responsible for making those voyages possible, for training the navigators and preparing the maps and providing the mathematical tools that would build an empire, was standing in a library in Mortlake, surrounded by books, about to reshape global history in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The map was wrong. Not slightly wrong, catastrophically wrong, and John Dee knew it. This was 1570, and England's navigators were still using charts drawn by Portuguese cartographers, maps that deliberately distorted distances to protect trade secrets. English ships sailed into the unknown, with instruments that couldn't measure longitude, charts that showed imaginary islands, and mathematical tables riddled with errors. They died. Regularly. Dee was going to fix that, not because the Queen asked him to, though she certainly needed it done, but because he'd recognised something that would define the next century of global power. Mathematics could be weaponised, geometry could conquer nations, and whoever controlled the best maps would control the world's wealth. He'd been preparing for this his entire career. The years in Leuven studying with Gemma Frisius, learning how to build navigation instruments, the friendship with Mercator, who'd shared techniques for projecting the curved Earth onto flat surfaces, the obsessive collection of astronomical tables, ship logs, and geographical treatises. All of it was converging into a single purpose. England needed to become a maritime power, and maritime power required mathematics. The Muscovy Company came to him first. They'd been granted a monopoly on Anglo-Russian trade and were desperate to find the Northeast Passage, a route over the top of Russia to reach China. The problem was simple. Nobody knew how to navigate polar waters. The sun behaved differently there. Compasses went haywire. Traditional methods failed completely. Dee spent months developing specialised charts. He calculated magnetic variation at different latitudes. He prepared tables for determining position using the sun's altitude at midnight during the polar summer. He taught the captains Euclidean geometry, not as abstract theory, but as practical survival skill. If you understand the mathematics of celestial position, you can find your location anywhere on Earth, even where previous methods break down. The expeditions failed to find the passage, but they returned, and that was revolutionary. For the first time, English sailors were venturing into waters where no European had survived, and they were coming back with detailed observations, accurate charts, and mathematical records that could be used by the next expedition. Dee had created a feedback loop. Each voyage generated data that improved the next voyage. Knowledge was accumulating. This is what separated Dee from his predecessors. Previous navigators treated their craft as a collection of tricks and traditions, passed down through apprenticeship, guarded as trade secrets. Dee was systematizing it. He was transforming navigation from art into science, from oral tradition into written method, from guild secret into public knowledge. His 1570 mathematical preface to Billingsley's English translation of Euclid was the manifesto, written in English, not Latin, aimed at craftsmen and mechanics, not university scholars. It argued that mathematics wasn't just for philosophers debating abstract principles in Oxford halls. It was for shipwrights designing hulls, for navigators plotting courses, for surveyors measuring land, for architects designing buildings. The preface became one of the most widely read texts in Elizabethan England. Artisans bought it, ship captains studied it. A generation of English mechanicians learned to see mathematics as the foundation of practical knowledge. Dee had democratized learning in a way the universities never could. But he wasn't doing this for altruism. He had a vision, and it was far more ambitious than just helping a few merchants find their way to Russia. In 1577, Dee published general and rare memorials pertaining to the perfect arte of navigation. The title sounds dry. The content was explosive. It proposed nothing less than a British Empire. That phrase, British Empire, appeared here for the first time. Dee coined it, and he didn't mean it metaphorically. He laid out a detailed plan for how England could claim vast territories in the New World, establish colonies, control trade routes, and become the dominant global power, all through naval supremacy based on superior navigation. The argument was brilliant in its audacity. Dee claimed that England had ancient historical rights to North American territories, tracing supposed connections back to King Arthur and medieval Welsh princes who had allegedly reached the Americas centuries before Columbus. The historical claims were dubious. Nobody cared. What mattered was that Dee was providing legal and philosophical justification for English expansion. He argued that maritime dominance was the key to everything. Land wars were expensive and limited, but control of the seas, that meant controlling commerce, controlling resources, controlling the flow of wealth itself. England was an island. That had always been seen as a weakness, making it vulnerable to invasion. Dee reframed it as England's greatest strategic advantage. If England built a powerful navy, trained in mathematical navigation, equipped with accurate charts and precise instruments, it could project power anywhere in the world. It could protect its merchants, raid its enemies, claim new territories, and do it all while remaining safe behind its oceanic moat. This vision shaped Elizabeth's foreign policy. The Queen read Dee's work, so did her ministers. So did the merchants and adventurers who would spend the next decades putting the vision into practice. Francis Drake, Martin Frobisher, Humphrey Gilbert, Walter Raleigh. All of them consulted with Dee. All of them used his charts and instruments. All of them were pursuing the mathematical, navigational, imperial dream that Dee had articulated. He trained the navigators personally. Men would come to Mortlake, the library becoming an informal academy where Dee taught the practical application of mathematics to seafaring. He showed them how to use cross-staffs and astrolabes to measure celestial angles. He explained how to calculate latitude from the sun's altitude. He walked them through the mathematics of great circle sailing, the shortest path between 2 points on a sphere. These weren't theoretical exercises. Dee built the instruments himself or acquired them from the best makers in Europe. He had quadrants, compasses, celestial globes, armillary spheres. The Mortlake Library wasn't just books, it was a workshop, a laboratory, a training ground for the men who would sail into uncharted waters and claim territories for England. The maps he created were military secrets. Dee understood that geographic knowledge was power. He kept multiple versions of his charts, some deliberately inaccurate for public distribution, others with true distances and positions reserved for English navigators. He marked potential harbours, noted prevailing winds, indicated where fresh water could be found. The maps were intelligence assets, and he was right about everything. Within decades, England would become a maritime superpower. The East India Company would establish trading posts across Asia. English colonies would appear in North America. The Navy would become the most powerful in the world. The foundation for all of it, the mathematical and navigational infrastructure, was laid by John Dee in the 1570s and 1580s. But there's a tension here that Dee never quite resolved. He was building an empire through mathematics, through rational systematic knowledge. Yet simultaneously, he was becoming increasingly convinced that the deepest truths couldn't be reached through mathematics alone. They required something else, something the universities didn't teach and the navigation manuals didn't contain: divine revelation. Dee's Hermeticism taught him that ancient wisdom had been lost. The perfect knowledge that Adam possessed in Eden, the secrets revealed to Enoch and Moses, the pristine understanding that unified all learning. It had fragmented over time, scattered into incomplete disciplines. Mathematics was one fragment, alchemy was another. Astrology, Kabbalah, natural magic, all fragments of the original whole. What if that knowledge could be recovered? What if someone could access the source directly? The idea wasn't crazy by 16th century standards. It was orthodox Christian theology that God had revealed himself to the prophets. The Bible was full of angels delivering messages, visions providing insight, divine wisdom breaking through to chosen individuals. Dee believed he could be one of those individuals, should be one of those individuals. His entire career had been preparation for this. He'd tried everything else. He'd read every book, studied every available text, mastered every known discipline. He'd pushed mathematics as far as it could go. He'd built the best library in England. He'd trained the navigators who were discovering new worlds. And still, there were questions he couldn't answer, gaps in understanding that books couldn't fill. So he turned to prayer, increasingly desperate, increasingly intense prayer, asking God to send his angels, to reveal the missing knowledge, to complete what the books had started. Nothing happened. For years, nothing happened. Dee would spend hours in his oratory, the private chapel he'd set up in his house, praying for angelic contact. Silence. He tried different methods, different rituals, different approaches. Still nothing. He wasn't a natural mystic. He didn't have visions. He didn't hear voices. He was a scholar trying to access non-scholarly knowledge, a mathematician trying to contact the immaterial, a careful systematic thinker, attempting something that required abandoning systematic thought. Then Edward Kelly showed up, and everything changed. March 1582, a stranger arrives at Mortlake, 28 years old, claiming to have the gift of scrying, the ability to see visions in crystals and mirrors. His background was suspicious. He'd been convicted of forgery. Rumour said he'd had his ears cut off as punishment, which is why he wore a cap constantly. He'd worked as an apothecary's apprentice, dabbled in alchemy, and had a reputation as a con artist. Dee should have turned him away, but he was desperate. And Kelly had something Dee lacked, the ability to see. They conducted a test. Dee set up his scrying equipment, a polished obsidian mirror that supposedly had Aztec origins, and asked Kelly to attempt contact with the angels. Kelly stared into the mirror. Less than 45 minutes later, he reported success. An angel had appeared. It was communicating. Dee hired him on the spot. £50 a year, enormous money for the time. He didn't care about Kelly's criminal past or dubious reputation. The man could do what Dee couldn't. He could see the angels, and if the angels were finally speaking, Dee needed to hear what they had to say. The sessions began immediately, almost daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Dee would set up the scrying equipment in his oratory. They'd pray. Kelly would gaze into the stone or mirror. Then he'd start reporting what he saw. Angels, dozens of them, each with a name, a specific appearance, a particular message. They spoke to Kelly, and Kelly translated for Dee, who wrote everything down in meticulous detail. Dates, times, the angels' words, descriptions of their appearance. Dee documented it all with the same precision he applied to astronomical observations. The angels promised revelations. They claimed they would teach Dee the original language of creation, the tongue spoken by Adam before the fall. They would reveal the true structure of the cosmos, the hidden connections between things, the mathematics that God used to build reality. Everything Dee had been seeking, finally within reach. Was it real? That's the wrong question. Or at least, it's not the question Dee was asking. He believed it was real. Completely. He approached the angel conversations with the same seriousness he brought to mathematics. This was research, investigation, systematic inquiry into divine truth. The methodology was different, but the goal was identical. Understanding. And the angels were delivering. They dictated entire books. They provided tables of letters in an unknown alphabet. They explained cosmological principles. They revealed names of power and chains of spiritual authority. The information was complex, detailed, internally consistent. It felt profound. Whether the angels existed independently or were projections of Kelly's mind or some combination of both didn't matter to Dee. The knowledge was coming through. After decades of searching, the gaps were being filled. But there was a cost. These sessions consumed him. Hours every day, sometimes stretching into the night. The navigation work continued. The consultations with sea captains. The map making. But increasingly, Dee's attention was elsewhere. The angels demanded focus. They required purity, prayer, devotion. They threatened to withdraw if Dee didn't meet their standards. The man who'd spent his career building England's maritime empire was disappearing into his oratory, chasing voices only his scryer could hear. The voices were about to tell him to leave England entirely, and when he listened, everything he'd built would start to crumble. In 1583, the angels gave their clearest command yet. Leave England, go to Poland. A Polish nobleman named Albert Waski had arrived in London. He was popular, charismatic, connected to royal courts across Europe. He visited Dee's library in Mortlake, impressed by the collection, intrigued by the reputation. Dee showed him the angel work, the tables of letters, the transcripts of conversations, the promises of divine revelation. Waski was fascinated. He invited Dee to Poland, promising patronage, promising access to powerful figures who might support the work. Dee hesitated. He had his library, his home, his position at court. Jane was pregnant again. They had children. Leaving England meant abandoning everything familiar, everything stable. But the angels insisted. Through Kelly, they delivered message after message. Go to Poland. The work cannot continue here. The revelation requires new ground. Dee's position at court was deteriorating anyway. Elizabeth still consulted him occasionally, but the intimacy was gone. Other advisors had her ear. The angel work made people nervous. Rumours spread about what happened in that oratory. Whispers about necromancy, about demonic practices, about things that went beyond acceptable philosophy. In September 1583, Dee made his decision. He, Jane, their children, Kelly, and Kelly's wife departed for Poland. They travelled with Waski, who promised everything would be arranged. The journey was long, uncomfortable, expensive, crossing the Channel, moving through the Low Countries, into German territories, finally reaching Poland. What they found there shattered every promise. Waski was broke, completely. The nobleman who'd seemed so wealthy, so well connected, was drowning in debt. He had no estate to offer them, no patronage to provide, no powerful friends to introduce. He'd invited Dee, hoping the angels might reveal alchemical secrets, might show how to transmute base metal into gold, might solve his financial ruin. That was the real reason for his interest, not divine knowledge, money. Dee was trapped. He'd left England, abandoned his library to whatever might happen in his absence, brought his pregnant wife and young children across Europe. And now he had nothing. No patron, no income, no plan. They became nomads, moving from city to city, seeking audiences with rulers who might support them, trying to explain the angel work to skeptical courts. The conversations continued, daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Kelly would scry, the angels would speak, Dee would record. The books grew longer, the revelations more complex, but nobody cared. Nobody was willing to fund this work. They managed to secure an audience with Emperor Rudolf II in Prague. Rudolf was unusual among European monarchs. He collected art, supported alchemists, welcomed scholars and mystics. His court was a strange gathering of intellectuals, charlatans and genuine researchers, all mixed together under his patronage. Dee thought Rudolf might understand, might see the value in what the angels were teaching. The audience was a disaster. Dee tried to explain, but Rudolf was distracted, skeptical, ultimately uninterested. The emperor had his own alchemists, his own mystics. He didn't need another Englishman making promises about divine revelation. Dee and Kelly were dismissed. No patronage, no support. They moved to Krakow, then back to Prague, then to Trebon. Years passed this way, wandering Central Europe, growing poorer, more desperate. Jane gave birth to another child, then another. The family expanded while their resources contracted. Dee sold what he could, books, instruments, anything of value. They lived on the edge of poverty, sustained only by occasional small grants from sympathetic nobles. The angel sessions became more intense, more demanding. The beings speaking through Kelly grew harsh, critical. They lectured Dee about his sins, his unworthiness, his failure to fully submit to divine will. They required greater purity, more devotion, longer prayers. The revelations came with conditions: obey completely or lose everything. Kelly was changing too. The scryer who'd been so enthusiastic at the start was exhausted. The sessions consumed hours daily. He had his own interests, his own alchemical work he wanted to pursue, and increasingly, he expressed doubts. He warned Dee that the beings they were contacting might not be angels, might be something else, something dangerous. Dee dismissed these warnings. He'd spent decades preparing for this. The angels were real. The knowledge was genuine. Kelly's doubts came from fatigue, from spiritual weakness. They needed to continue. They were so close to the complete revelation. Then in April 1587, during a session in Trebon, Kelly reported something that would destroy everything. The angel Madimi, who'd been a frequent presence in the conversations, delivered a command. All things must be held in common between Dee and Kelly. All possessions, all property, including wives. Dee was horrified. He understood what this meant. The angel was ordering them to share Jane and Kelly's wife, to swap partners, to violate everything he believed about marriage, about morality, about proper Christian behaviour. He argued with Kelly. This couldn't be genuine. Angels wouldn't command something so obviously wrong. Kelly insisted he was only reporting what he saw, what he heard. The message was clear. If they wanted the revelations to continue, they had to obey completely. No exceptions, no qualifications. Dee spent days in anguish. He prayed, he consulted his books, he searched for any way to reconcile this command with his faith. Jane was devastated. She didn't want this. She'd followed her husband across Europe, lived in poverty, raised their children in foreign cities. Now this. The angels wanted her to sleep with Kelly, but Dee believed, after everything, after years of conversations, thousands of pages of transcribed revelations, he believed the angels were real, and if they were real, their commands had to be obeyed. God's will, no matter how incomprehensible, had to be followed. They did it. Dee and Kelly shared wives. The details are sparse. Dee's journals become vague, coded, uncomfortable. He recorded that the command was followed, nothing more. Whether it happened once or multiple times, whether Jane and Kelly's wife were truly willing or simply compliant, we'll never know. 9 months later, Jane gave birth to a son, Theodore. The timing made paternity uncertain. Was this Dee's child or Kelly's? Nobody could be sure. The uncertainty must have been excruciating. Every time Dee looked at the baby, he'd wonder, is this my son? Shortly after this, the partnership dissolved. Kelly had finally had enough. The wife-sharing episode, whether it was his genuine attempt to end the collaboration or something else, accomplished its purpose. He was done with the angel work. He wanted to focus on alchemy, on his own projects. He left Dee's household. The scryer who'd seen the angels, who delivered the revelations, was gone. Dee was alone in a foreign country, his family with him, but no income, no patron, no way forward. The angel conversations had ended, not by his choice, not because the revelation was complete, because his scryer had abandoned him. He tried to continue alone, attempted to scry himself, to contact the angels directly. Nothing. The gift he'd never possessed remained absent. Without Kelly, there were no angels. Without angels, there was no purpose. In 1589, after 6 years abroad, Dee gave up. He wrote to Elizabeth, begging for help, for passage home, for anything. She responded, not warmly, not generously, but she responded. She arranged for his return, provided some money for the journey. The trip back took months. The family retraced their route through Central Europe, through Germany, through the Low Countries, finally crossing the Channel, finally reaching England, finally returning to Mortlake. What Dee found there destroyed whatever hope remained. His house had been vandalised, repeatedly. Windows smashed, doors broken, walls damaged. But worse was the library, the greatest private collection in England. 3,000 volumes, manuscripts collected across decades, irreplaceable texts, gone, stolen, destroyed. Neighbours had broken in during his absence. Some took books, others simply destroyed them, tearing pages, burning what they didn't understand. The occult reputation had made his home a target. While he was chasing angels in Bohemia, English mobs were dismantling the life's work he'd left behind. He tried to rebuild, wrote to friends, to former patrons, asking for help recovering what was lost. Some books were returned, most weren't. The library that had been the foundation of his research, the tool that made everything else possible, was shattered beyond repair. Elizabeth gave him a position, warden of Christ's College in Manchester. It was something, a salary, a role, a reason to continue. But it wasn't what he'd been. It wasn't the trusted advisor to the Queen, the navigator of empires, the scholar consulting with the greatest minds in Europe. Manchester was a come-down, a provincial posting far from London, far from the centres of power. The college was small, poorly funded, filled with students who didn't care about his reputation or his past achievements. He was just the warden, another administrator, nobody special. He performed his duties, managed the college, dealt with petty disputes, tried to maintain some standards of learning, but his heart wasn't in it. How could it be? He'd spoken with angels, he'd received divine revelations, he'd attempted to recover the original language of creation, and now he was settling arguments about student behaviour in a Manchester college. The angel work haunted him. Those years in Europe, Those thousands of hours in the oratory, those revelations that had seemed so profound, had it been real? Had he actually contacted divine beings, or had he been deceived? By Kelly? By demons masquerading as angels? By his own desperate need to believe? He never got an answer. The angels never returned. Kelly never recanted or confirmed. The transcripts remained, volumes of conversations recorded in Dee's meticulous handwriting. Evidence of something, but evidence of what? Dee's final years were quiet. He continued as warden until 1604, wrote petitions to the new king, James I, asking for support, for recognition of his services to England. James ignored him. The new monarch had no interest in occult philosophy, in angel conversations, in men who'd spent their careers straddling the line between science and magic. Jane died in 1604. The plague took her. After everything they'd been through together, after following him across Europe, after bearing his children in foreign cities, after the humiliation of the wife-sharing, she died of plague in Manchester. Dee was 77 years old and alone. He returned to Mortlake. The house was still there, still damaged, still empty of the books that had once filled it. He lived quietly, relied on charity from former students, from people who remembered his earlier work. The man who'd advised queens died in poverty and obscurity. December 1608, that's when it ended. John Dee, mathematician, navigator, occultist, advisor to monarchs, speaker with angels, dead at 81, buried in Mortlake, no elaborate funeral, no great recognition of his achievements. Just another old man, gone. His reputation followed predictably. The angel work overshadowed everything else. The mathematical achievements, the navigation contributions, the role in building England's maritime empire. All forgotten. People remembered the conjurer, the man who claimed to speak with angels, the charlatan or madman, depending on who was telling the story. His library's destruction meant most of his work was lost. The books he'd written, the translations he'd made, the mathematical treatises, gone. What survived was fragmentary, scattered. The angel diaries remained because he'd kept them close, but the solid, respectable scholarly work mostly vanished. For centuries, that's who he was. John Dee, the magician, the occultist, the man who'd been deceived by a con artist with cut-off ears. Nobody talked about the navigation work. Nobody mentioned the mathematical preface to Euclid. Nobody cared about his role in building the British Empire. The angels had consumed his legacy. But here's what's strange about that narrative. It's not entirely accurate. The reputation that calcified around Dee, the image of the deluded magician, deceived by a con artist, misses something crucial about how his contemporaries actually viewed him. During his lifetime, the angel work didn't destroy his credibility the way you'd expect. Not immediately, not completely. Elizabeth never abandoned him. She kept him on, kept consulting him, kept him in her orbit. When she appointed him warden of Christ's College in Manchester in 1595, that wasn't exile. That was a decent position, a sign of continued royal favour. Not what he'd hoped for, certainly, but not abandonment either. The real problem wasn't the angels, it was timing. By the 1590s, England was changing. The generation that had embraced Renaissance occult philosophy, that had seen no contradiction between mathematics and magic, between science and spiritual revelation, was dying off. A new intellectual climate was emerging, more sceptical, more materialist, less comfortable with the blurred boundaries Dee had spent his life exploring. And then Elizabeth died, 1603. That changed everything. James I took the throne, and James had very specific opinions about magic. He'd written a book about it, Daemonology, published in 1597. It was a treatise on witchcraft, arguing for its reality and its danger. James believed in supernatural evil, absolutely believed in it, But he also believed it should be feared and suppressed, not studied or engaged with. For men like Dee, this was catastrophic. The new king saw occult investigation as trafficking with demons, regardless of the practitioner's intentions. The distinction Dee had always insisted on between pious seeking after divine wisdom and demonic conjuration, James didn't recognize it. To him, it was all dangerous, all suspect. Dee's petitions to James went nowhere. He wrote them carefully, explaining his work, his service to England, his contributions to navigation and mathematics. James wasn't interested. The man who'd advised Elizabeth, who'd helped build England's maritime empire, who'd trained the navigators that were expanding English power across the globe, that man got nothing from the new regime. So Dee's final years really were diminished, not because of the angel work specifically, but because the intellectual world had shifted beneath him. The synthesis he represented, that Renaissance fusion of science and magic, mathematics and mysticism, was becoming untenable. You had to choose sides now. You were either a mathematician or a magician, not both. And once he died, the distortion accelerated. The 17th century wasn't kind to Dee's memory. Writers mentioned him primarily as a cautionary tale, the scholar who'd been deceived, the learned man who'd fallen into error. His mathematical work, his contributions to navigation, his role in England's expansion, all of that faded. What remained was the conjurer. This is how reputations get constructed, not through careful evaluation of someone's entire body of work, but through selective emphasis. The parts that fit the narrative get remembered. The parts that complicate it get forgotten. Dee's angel conversations were dramatic, scandalous, easy to understand, and mock. His work on navigation was technical, complex, boring to most people. Guess which one survived in popular memory? But there's another layer here. Because even the simplified version of Dee's reputation, the magician story, isn't quite right. It assumes Kelly was definitely a fraud, that the angel conversations were definitely fake, that Dee was definitely deceived. And we don't actually know that. Consider what we have. Thousands of pages of angel conversations recorded meticulously by Dee over years. The transcripts are detailed, consistent, elaborate. They describe a complex angelology, a sophisticated system of magic, an entire cosmology. Either Kelly improvised all of this, making up coherent spiritual teachings on the spot for years, or something else was happening. Kelly could have been a fraud. Absolutely. The evidence is strong. Criminal background, suspicious behaviour, the wife-swapping incident that seems designed to manipulate Dee. All of that points toward con artistry. But if he was just a con artist, he was an extraordinarily talented one. The material he produced through the scrying sessions is too complex, too internally consistent to be simple improvisation. Some scholars have suggested Kelly believed it himself, that he genuinely thought he was seeing angels, that the visions were real to him, even if they weren't objectively real. This would make him not a fraud but a visionary, someone experiencing what he interpreted as divine contact. Dee would still have been deceived, but by something more complicated than a simple con. Or maybe Dee wasn't deceived at all. Maybe he got exactly what he was looking for. Access to a system of spiritual knowledge that, true or not, allowed him to explore territories that conventional scholarship couldn't reach. The angel conversations as a kind of inspired creativity, a method of accessing unconscious wisdom through ritual and symbol. This interpretation seems charitable, modern even, treating the angel work as something like Jung's active imagination, a psychological technique rather than literal spirit contact. But it's worth considering because it takes Dee seriously, in a way the fraud narrative doesn't. It assumes he was an intelligent person, pursuing something meaningful, rather than a gullible fool taken in by a criminal. The truth? We'll never know. The evidence doesn't exist to settle the question definitively. What we can say is that Dee believed. That matters. Whatever Kelly was doing, whatever was actually happening In that oratory in Mortlake, Dee experienced it as real, and that experience shaped the rest of his life. So when we ask what Dee's legacy is, what we're really asking is which version of him matters. The mathematician who helped England become a maritime power, the occultist who tried to speak with angels, the scholar whose library was one of Europe's finest, the man who coined the term British Empire. He was all of these simultaneously, and our discomfort with that multiplicity says more about us than about him. The 19th century began rehabilitating Dee's reputation. Scholars started looking past the angel's story to his mathematical work. They recognized his contributions to navigation, his role in promoting Euclidean geometry, his influence on the development of English science. The preface to Euclid got rediscovered. People realized it had been hugely influential, that it had helped create the class of mathematical practitioners who'd built England's technical infrastructure. By the 20th century, historians were taking Dee seriously as a Renaissance polymath, not dismissing the angel work, but contextualizing it, understanding that in the 16th century, the boundaries between science and magic weren't where we'd put them now, that someone could be both a rigorous mathematician and a mystical seeker without contradiction. Frances Yates's work in the 1960s and 70s was particularly important. She placed Dee within the tradition of Renaissance Hermeticism, showing how his occult interests connected to broader intellectual currents of his time. He wasn't an isolated crank. He was part of a widespread movement trying to recover ancient wisdom, trying to synthesize classical knowledge with Christian revelation. Modern scholarship has gone further. It's examined Dee's political role, his relationship with the Elizabethan state, his involvement in intelligence work. Turns out he wasn't just advising on navigation for peaceful purposes. He was helping plan England's maritime expansion, its competition with Spain, its colonial ventures. The British Empire he envisioned wasn't abstract. It was a concrete political programme. And the angel conversations? Modern scholars read them as political documents too. The angels gave advice on statecraft, on England's role in European affairs, on religious conflict. They weren't just delivering mystical wisdom. They were commenting on contemporary politics, using divine authority to promote particular positions. Whether Dee and Kelly knew they were doing this is another question, but the content is there. So Dee emerges as a more complex figure than either the credulous magician or the pure mathematician. He was operating at the intersection of multiple worlds: court politics, intellectual inquiry, spiritual seeking, technical innovation. And he was trying to synthesize them, to create a unified vision where mathematics and mysticism reinforced each other, where navigation and angelology were parts of the same project. That synthesis failed. Not because it was wrong exactly, but because the world moved on. The 17th century developed new ways of organizing knowledge. Science separated from magic. Mathematics became purely secular. The spiritual and material realms that Dee had tried to bridge pulled apart. His approach became untenable, but the failure was productive. The mathematical work survived, influenced later developments, even when Dee's name was forgotten. The Angel Diaries preserved a record of Renaissance occultism that scholars still mine for insight. The political vision of a British Empire, however problematic we might find it now, shaped England's self-understanding for centuries. What Dee represents is a moment of possibility that didn't last. A time when you could be both scientist and magician, when knowledge hadn't yet been compartmentalized into the rigid categories we're used to. He lived at the boundary between medieval and modern, trying to preserve what was valuable from the older worldview while embracing the new. He didn't succeed in creating the synthesis he wanted. The world wasn't ready for it, or maybe it was impossible from the start. But the attempt itself is fascinating. It shows us someone wrestling with fundamental questions about knowledge, truth, and how humans access deeper understanding. questions we're still wrestling with, just using different vocabulary. And here's what's most striking about Dee's story. Despite everything, despite the reputation damage and the poverty and the obscurity of his final years, despite the centuries of being remembered as a fool or a charlatan, his work survived. Not intact, not in the form he intended, but it survived. The mathematical contributions influenced people who never knew his name. The Angel Diaries became source material for occultists and scholars. The vision of England as a maritime power became reality, even if nobody credited him for articulating it first. That's the strange persistence of ideas. They outlive their creators, transform in ways those creators wouldn't recognize, influence people who don't know where they came from. Dee wanted to be remembered as the man who'd recovered the original wisdom, who'd spoken with angels, who'd bridged heaven and earth. He wasn't remembered that way, but pieces of what he built became part of the foundation of modern England anyway, invisible but present. The house in Mortlake is gone now. The library dispersed centuries ago, books scattered across Europe, many lost forever. The Angel Diaries survive in manuscript, carefully preserved despite their controversial content. The Monas Hieroglyphica is still studied, though nobody quite understands what Dee thought it meant. The preface to Euclid is recognised as an important document in the history of English mathematics. And somewhere in all of that fragmentation, in the pieces that survived and the pieces that didn't, John Dee persists, not as the unified figure he wanted to be, but as a collection of influences, ideas, possibilities, a reminder that the past was stranger than we usually imagine, that the people we've simplified into historical types were more complicated than the stories we tell about them. But maybe the real question isn't what Dee accomplished or failed to accomplish. Maybe it's what his life tells us about the nature of knowledge itself and how civilizations decide what counts as legitimate understanding. Because Dee lived through one of history's great transitions, when the rules about what you could know and how you could know it were being fundamentally rewritten. Think about the world Dee was born into. In 1527, knowledge still operated on medieval principles. Universities taught from ancient texts. Authority mattered more than evidence. The universe was a book written by God, and understanding it meant decoding divine messages hidden in nature. This wasn't superstition, it was the intellectual framework everyone used. Mathematics existed, but it was subordinate to theology. Natural philosophy was still trying to reconcile Aristotle with Christian doctrine. The idea that you could learn about the world simply by observing it carefully and measuring things precisely was gaining ground, but slowly. Most scholars still believed that true knowledge came from studying authoritative texts, not from experimentation. Dee straddled this divide his entire life. He was trained in the old methods, but attracted to the new. He believed in angels and divine revelation, but also in careful measurement and mathematical proof. He thought ancient wisdom held secrets, but also that observation and calculation could reveal truth. This wasn't confusion. It was an attempt to synthesize two ways of knowing. His mathematical work was genuinely modern. The preface to Euclid promoted practical application of geometry. It encouraged craftsmen and navigators to use mathematical principles. It treated numbers as tools for understanding physical reality. This approach would eventually become standard, but in 1570 it was radical. Dee was arguing that mathematics shouldn't be locked away in universities. It should be accessible to anyone who needed it. At the same time, he was recording conversations with angels, writing down elaborate ceremonies and divine messages, believing that spiritual beings were teaching him the language of creation. To modern minds, this seems like a contradiction. How could someone be both rational and mystical? But that's the wrong question. Dee didn't see a contradiction. In his worldview, mathematics and magic were connected. Both were ways of accessing deeper truth, Both required discipline and study. Both revealed patterns hidden beneath surface appearances. The universe was mathematical because God had designed it that way. Understanding mathematics meant understanding divine creation. This unified approach didn't survive. Over the next century, knowledge would be divided into separate domains: science, religion, philosophy, each with its own methods and boundaries. The synthesis Dee attempted would become impossible because the categories themselves would pull apart. You could be a scientist or a theologian, but not both in the way Dee tried to be both. Why did this happen? Partly because the new scientific methods proved incredibly powerful. Galileo's observations, Newton's mathematics, the entire mechanical philosophy, these approaches generated results that the old synthesis couldn't match. If you wanted to predict planetary motions or understand falling bodies, mathematical physics worked better than angelic revelation. Success bred specialization. But something was lost too. Dee's approach asked big questions about meaning and purpose. What is the universe for? Why does it have the structure it has? How do we fit into the cosmic order? The new science deliberately set aside these questions to focus on how things work, rather than why they exist. More productive, yes, but also narrower. These angel conversations represent the last gasp of a dying worldview. The belief that the universe was fundamentally meaningful, that divine beings took interest in human affairs, that studying nature meant discovering God's intentions. Within a generation, this approach would seem quaint. Within 2 generations, embarrassing. Yet Dee wasn't naive. His angel diaries show sophisticated thinking about knowledge and certainty. He worried constantly about deception. Were the angels real or was Kelly lying? How could you verify spiritual information? What counted as proof? These are epistemological questions, questions about how we know what we know, and they're still relevant. Modern science solved this problem by restricting itself to claims that can be tested and measured. If you can't verify something empirically, science doesn't make claims about it. This is powerful but limited. It means science deliberately ignores questions that humans care deeply about: meaning, purpose, value, the nature of consciousness. These get pushed into other domains: philosophy or religion or art. Dee wanted to keep everything together. He thought you could have empirical knowledge and spiritual knowledge, mathematical precision and divine revelation. The failure of his synthesis doesn't mean he was wrong to try. It means the intellectual world wasn't structured to support that kind of integration. His reputation suffered precisely because he attempted this. In the 17th century, as science and magic separated, Dee ended up on the wrong side of the line. His mathematical work was respectable, but his angel conversations weren't. Later, scholars had to decide what to do with him: emphasize the mathematics and ignore the magic, dismiss him entirely as a charlatan, try to understand him in his own context. Most chose dismissal or embarrassment. The Victorians, who loved categorizing everything, couldn't fit Dee into their boxes. He wasn't a proper scientist because of all the occultism. He wasn't a proper occultist because of all the mathematics. He was a hybrid creature from a time before categories hardened. This says more about Victorian anxieties than about Dee. They were living in a world where science and religion were in open conflict, where you had to choose sides. Looking back at someone who didn't choose sides made them uncomfortable. It suggested that the conflict might not be inevitable, that there might have been other paths. Recent scholarship has been kinder to Dee, partly because we're more comfortable with historical complexity. We can recognise that 16th century categories weren't the same as ours. We can see Dee as a product of his time, rather than judging him by standards that didn't yet exist. We can appreciate his mathematical contributions without dismissing his spiritual beliefs. But there's still discomfort. We want our historical figures to be consistent, to fit narratives we understand. The brilliant mathematician shouldn't also be talking to angels. The trusted royal advisor shouldn't be conducting elaborate magical ceremonies. These combinations feel wrong because they violate our sense of what goes together. Yet Dee's life demonstrates that our categories are contingent, not natural. There's no inherent reason why mathematics and mysticism can't coexist in one person. We've separated them because it proved useful to do so, but the separation isn't inevitable. Other cultures have organized knowledge differently. Future cultures might organize it differently still. What if Dee's synthesis had succeeded? It's an impossible counterfactual, but worth considering. Imagine a world where science developed without abandoning questions of meaning and purpose, where mathematical precision coexisted with spiritual inquiry, where the study of nature included both how things work and what they're for. Would we have made the same technological progress? Probably not. The power of modern science comes partly from its narrow focus. By restricting itself to measurable phenomena, it can make precise predictions and reliable interventions. Adding spiritual dimensions back in would likely reduce that precision. But we might have avoided some problems. The sense that science has made the universe meaningless and cold. The conflict between scientific and religious worldviews that still tears societies apart. The feeling that our knowledge is fragmented, that we understand parts of reality but can't see the whole. Dee tried to see the whole. That was his ambition and his downfall. The whole proved too large, too complicated, too resistant to unified understanding. Or maybe the tools available in the 16th century just weren't up to the task. Either way, the synthesis failed and knowledge split apart. His mathematical legacy survived because it fit the new paradigm. The preface to Euclid could be read as promoting practical mathematics without the mystical baggage. The navigational work contributed to England's maritime expansion. The vision of a British Empire became reality, though stripped of its original spiritual justifications. The angelic material survived too, but in a different register. It became source material for occultists, historians of magic, scholars of Renaissance thought. People still study the angel diaries, not because they believe angels dictated them, but because they reveal how Renaissance minds worked, what they thought was possible, how they understood the boundaries between natural and supernatural. This division of Dee's legacy reflects the broader division of knowledge. The respectable parts get claimed by science and history. The weird parts get filed under occultism or curiosity. Nobody tries to hold them together anymore because we've lost the framework that would make that combination meaningful. Except that's not quite true. There are still people who try to synthesize science and spirituality, who believe the universe is both measurable and meaningful. They're usually dismissed as confused or fraudulent, the same way Dee was dismissed, but they're attempting something similar, trying to resist the fragmentation of knowledge. Whether this is wise or foolish depends on your perspective. If you think the separation of science and religion was progress, then trying to reverse it looks like regression. If you think something important was lost in that separation, then the attempt at synthesis looks valuable, even if it's unlikely to succeed. Dee's story doesn't resolve this. It just shows us someone who tried and failed, but whose failure was instructive. He demonstrated both the appeal and the difficulty of unified knowledge. He showed what you could accomplish with that approach, the insights you could generate, the questions you could ask, and he showed what you couldn't accomplish, the contradictions you couldn't resolve, the evidence you couldn't ignore. The world moved past him because it had to. The intellectual framework he worked within couldn't support the new knowledge being generated. Observations accumulated that didn't fit the old cosmology. Mathematical techniques developed that didn't require spiritual justification. The universe proved to be stranger and more complex than Renaissance philosophy could accommodate. But standing at his grave in Manchester, knowing everything we know now about how the story ended, it's hard not to feel something like respect. He tried. He tried to hold together things that were pulling apart. He tried to preserve what was valuable from the old worldview while embracing what was new. He tried to be both scientist and mystic, both mathematician and magician. He failed. The categories wouldn't hold. The synthesis collapsed. His reputation suffered. His library was destroyed. His angel conversations became embarrassing rather than enlightening. But the attempt itself remains fascinating because it shows us a road not taken, a possibility that didn't work out but might have. And maybe that's what makes Dee's story worth telling. Not because he succeeded, but because his failure illuminates something about how knowledge works and how it changes. Every time a civilization reorganizes its understanding of reality, there are people caught in the transition. People who try to bridge the old and new, who resist the categorical boundaries being drawn. Most of them fail. The boundaries get drawn anyway. Knowledge fragments into specialties. The unified vision proves unworkable. But the attempt matters because it reminds us that the boundaries are choices, not inevitabilities. The boundaries we draw around knowledge aren't neutral. They determine what questions seem legitimate, what methods seem valid, what combinations seem absurd. Before the scientific revolution, asking about the spiritual significance of mathematical relationships was normal. After it, that question became illegitimate, something only confused people would pursue. Dee lived through that transition. He watched the questions he considered most important become embarrassing. He experienced firsthand what happens when intellectual frameworks shift and leave people stranded. His diaries document this experience with painful clarity. The entries from the 1580s and 1590s show a man increasingly isolated, defending methods nobody respected anymore, pursuing questions nobody cared about. He kept recording his angel conversations even as educated opinion turned against him. He kept calculating astrological charts, even as astronomy separated itself from astrology. He kept searching for the philosopher's stone, even as chemistry began distinguishing itself from alchemy. Why? Why not adapt? Why not abandon the parts of his worldview that were becoming obsolete and embrace the parts that were succeeding? Because he couldn't. The whole thing was integrated. His mathematics made sense within a universe that was meaningful. His navigation techniques assumed celestial influences. His library organization reflected his belief that all knowledge ultimately connected. You couldn't extract the useful parts and discard the mystical parts because they were fundamentally entangled. This is what makes his story tragic, rather than just unfortunate. He wasn't stupid or stubborn. He was trapped by the very thing that had made him brilliant. His comprehensive vision, the framework that had enabled his achievements, now prevented him from adapting to new circumstances. The Manchester years show this clearly. Elizabeth appointed him warden of Christ's College in 1595, probably hoping to keep him busy and out of trouble. It was a position of moderate responsibility, managing a collegiate church and its associated school. For most people, it would have been a decent retirement post. For Dee, it was exile. Manchester in the 1590s was provincial, disconnected from the intellectual currents he'd spent his life engaging with. The position came with housing and a salary, but also with administrative headaches and local politics. He had to manage property, settle disputes, deal with church hierarchy. The man who had advised queens and designed voyages of exploration was now arguing about building repairs and staff appointments. His letters from this period are full of complaints, not about the work itself, but about the isolation. He was cut off from his library, from his instruments, from the conversations that had sustained him. He kept trying to correspond with people in London, but the responses grew fewer and less engaged. The intellectual world was moving on without him. He made several trips back to London, petitioning Elizabeth and later James for support, for recognition, for some acknowledgement of his service. He wanted his losses from the vandalised library compensated. He wanted his reputation restored. He wanted, most of all, to be useful again. Elizabeth was sympathetic, but offered little concrete help. She was old herself by then. dealing with succession crises and war expenses. She couldn't afford to subsidize an aging scholar's experiments, however much she'd valued his advice decades earlier. She gave him small gifts, expressions of goodwill, but nothing substantial. James was worse. The new king had written a book condemning witchcraft and magic. He viewed Dee's angel conversations with deep suspicion. When Dee petitioned him, James essentially ignored him. The man who had chosen Elizabeth's coronation date couldn't get an audience with her successor. So Dee stayed in Manchester, grew older, kept working on projects nobody wanted. He still believed the angels would reveal the ultimate secrets. He still thought the Monars Hieroglyphica contained profound truths. He still calculated astrological charts, still searched for the philosopher's stone, still tried to synthesize everything he knew into a unified system. His health declined. His wife Jane died in 1604, leaving him with young children to care for. His son Arthur took over some responsibilities, but Arthur was pursuing alchemy in his own way, not particularly interested in his father's angel conversations or mathematical mysticism. The family struggled financially. Dee's salary was irregular, his expenses constant. He died in poverty in 1608 or 1609. The exact date is uncertain, which itself says something about how far he'd fallen. When he was important, people tracked his movements carefully. By the end, nobody was paying attention. There's no grand deathbed scene recorded, no final words preserved, no dramatic revelation. He just faded away in Manchester, an old man whose time had passed, whose methods had failed, whose vision the world no longer needed. What do you do with a legacy like that? How do you evaluate someone who was simultaneously brilliant and deluded, innovative and trapped, ahead of his time and behind it? The easy answer is to split him. Take the mathematics and navigation. Call that the real Dee, the one who mattered. File the angel conversations under delusion or fraud, something to be explained away or ignored. This is what most popular accounts do. They present him as a legitimate scholar who unfortunately went off the rails in his later years, corrupted by charlatans like Kelly, pursuing mysticism when he should have stuck to mathematics. But this narrative doesn't work. It makes the angel conversations an aberration when they were actually central to his project. It makes the mysticism a late-life crisis when he'd been interested in it from the beginning. It creates an artificial division in a life that was remarkably consistent in its aims, however much the methods varied. The harder answer is to take him on his own terms, to recognize that for him, mathematics and mysticism were part of the same quest, that his navigation techniques and his angel conversations were both attempts to understand a universe he believed was meaningful. This doesn't mean accepting that angels actually dictated Enochian language. It means understanding why someone would pursue that alongside legitimate science. From his perspective, both were valid methods of investigation. Mathematics revealed God's design in creation. Angels revealed God's intentions for humanity. Both were ways of accessing divine knowledge, of understanding the structure of reality. The fact that one proved more productive than the other wasn't obvious at the time. It only became clear in retrospect after the scientific method had demonstrated its power and the mystical approaches had failed to deliver their promised revelations. Dee's tragedy is that he bet on synthesis in an age moving towards specialization. He tried to hold together what the modern world was pulling apart. He pursued a comprehensive understanding of everything when knowledge was fragmenting into separate disciplines, each with its own methods and assumptions. This makes him look confused to modern eyes. We've internalized the separation. We understand immediately why mathematics and mysticism should be kept apart, why astrology isn't astronomy, why alchemy isn't chemistry. These distinctions seem natural, inevitable, like they were always there waiting to be discovered. But they weren't. They were constructed gradually through conflict and debate. by people making choices about what counted as legitimate knowledge. Dee was on the wrong side of those choices. His comprehensive vision lost to the specialized approaches that would eventually become modern science. Yet something was lost in that victory. The sense that knowledge should integrate, that understanding one thing should illuminate everything else, that the universe is fundamentally coherent. Modern scholarship is fragmented. Experts know enormous amounts about tiny subjects, but struggle to see connections across disciplines. We've gained depth at the cost of breadth. Dee represents the last moment when one person could plausibly claim to understand all of human knowledge. After him, that became impossible. The body of knowledge grew too large, too specialized, too technical for any individual to master. We gained precision and lost unity. Whether that trade was worth it depends on what you value. If you think accurate specialized knowledge is better than grand comprehensive visions that don't actually work, then the trade was good. If you think we've lost something important in fragmenting knowledge, then the trade was costly. Dee's life doesn't answer that question. It just shows us someone standing at the pivot point, trying to prevent the fragmentation, failing, and leaving behind a record of what was lost in the transition. His library, before it was destroyed, represented that comprehensive vision. Mathematics next to alchemy, navigation manuals next to mystical texts, astronomy next to astrology. Everything connected because he believed everything was connected. The vandalism that destroyed much of that library during his absence has symbolic weight. It wasn't just theft or carelessness. It was the physical destruction of an intellectual vision that the world was abandoning. The books that survived scattered into different collections, separated by the same categorical boundaries that Dee had resisted. The mathematics went to scientific libraries, the mysticism to occult collections. The unity was broken. Standing in Christ's College, Manchester, where he spent his final years, you can feel the absence. The building still exists, though much rebuilt. There's a plaque acknowledging his wardenship. But there's no sense of what he was actually doing here, what he was thinking, what he was trying to accomplish. He's just a name, a historical footnote, someone who once held a position. The real monument to Dee isn't in Manchester. It's scattered across libraries and museums, in the books that survive from his collection, in the manuscripts where he recorded his angel conversations, in the instruments he designed for navigation. These fragments hint at what the whole might have been, at the comprehensive vision he was trying to construct. But we can only see it in pieces now. We've lost the framework that would let us understand it as a unity. We approach his work with modern categorical boundaries firmly in place, separating the respectable parts from the embarrassing parts, the science from the magic, the real from the delusional. This approach lets us salvage what's useful. We can study his mathematical contributions without worrying about his mystical beliefs. We can appreciate his navigation techniques without endorsing his astrology. We can value his book collecting without taking seriously his conversations with angels. But we also lose something. We lose the sense of what he was actually trying to do, the animating vision that connected all these different activities. We turn him into a collection of specialties when he was trying to be something else entirely, a universal scholar, a magus, someone who understood everything because everything was ultimately one. That aspiration seems almost quaint now. Nobody tries to master all knowledge anymore. We accept that specialization is necessary, that depth requires narrowness, that you can't know everything. We've adapted to the fragmentation that Dee resisted. But every so often, usually in private, someone asks whether we've lost something important, whether the connections between disciplines matter, whether there's value in trying to see the whole picture, even if you can't master all the details, whether synthesis should be attempted even when it's unlikely to succeed. These questions don't have clear answers. The modern world runs on specialization. It works producing knowledge and technology at rates Dee couldn't have imagined. But the questions persist because something in us still wants what he wanted: comprehensive understanding, meaningful connections, unity beneath the diversity. Dee's life suggests that wanting this might be noble even when achieving it proves impossible. The final years tell a different story than the dramatic rise or the spectacular fall. They're about what happens when someone outlives their usefulness, when the world moves on while you're still standing there, trying to explain why your work mattered. Dee died in December 1608, or possibly early 1609. The exact date is uncertain, which feels appropriate. He was around 81 years old, ancient by the standards of his era. He died in poverty at his daughter Catherine's house in Mortlake, the same town where his great library had once stood. The library was gone, the books scattered or stolen. The instruments that had guided England's explorers were lost or forgotten. The burial was quiet. Holy Trinity Church in Mortlake. No elaborate monument, just a simple grave that would eventually be lost when the church was rebuilt centuries later. Nobody knows exactly where John Dee is buried. The man who had advised a queen, who had shaped England's imperial ambitions, who had owned the greatest private library in the country, disappeared into the ground without a marker that would survive. His son Arthur inherited what little remained. Arthur would become a respected physician, an alchemist himself, spending much of his life trying to defend his father's reputation. The effort was mostly futile. By the time Arthur was writing, England had moved decisively away from the kind of thinking that had made John Dee significant. The division between science and magic was hardening into official doctrine. You couldn't be both anymore. You had to choose. Arthur chose to emphasize his father's scientific work and downplay the angelic conversations. This became the pattern for centuries. Defenders would rescue Dee's mathematical contributions while distancing themselves from the embarrassing mystical stuff. Critics would use the mystical stuff to dismiss everything else. Both approaches missed the essential point, which is that Dee himself saw no distinction. The mathematics and the mysticism were part of the same project, attempts to understand the same unified reality. The reputation went through predictable cycles. The 17th century largely forgot him or remembered him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of dabbling in the occult. The 18th century, with its Enlightenment rationalism, had no use for him at all. He was occasionally mentioned as an example of pre-scientific superstition, the kind of confused thinking that proper scientific method had replaced. Then something interesting happened in the 19th century. The Romantic movement, with its interest in mysticism and its resistance to pure materialism, rediscovered Dee. Suddenly he wasn't just a confused medieval thinker. He was a visionary, someone who had understood that reality was more complex than mechanical materialism allowed. The occultists claimed him as a predecessor. The spiritualists saw him as a pioneer of communication with other realms. This created a new problem. Now Dee had two incompatible reputations. To historians of science, he was an early mathematician and navigation expert, whose work unfortunately got mixed up with mystical nonsense. To occultists and esotericists, he was a magus whose true achievements in contacting angelic realms were being obscured by narrow-minded focus on his mundane mathematical work. Both groups were still trying to separate things that Dee had deliberately connected. Neither could accept him on his own terms, as someone pursuing a unified understanding that didn't respect the boundaries that would later be established between different types of knowledge. The 20th century brought more sophisticated historical approaches. Scholars began examining Dee in his actual historical context, rather than judging him by later standards. Francis Yates's work in the 1960s and 70s showed how Renaissance thinkers like Dee operated in an intellectual world where natural magic, mathematics, and religious devotion were seen as complementary rather than contradictory. Deborah Harkness's more recent research has revealed the practical side of Dee's work, showing how his angel conversations were structured experiments with detailed protocols and careful record-keeping. We're finally reaching a point where we can see Dee as he was rather than as we need him to be. He wasn't a proto-scientist who unfortunately also believed in magic. He wasn't a magician who happened to know some mathematics. He was an Elizabethan intellectual working within a framework where all these pursuits made sense together. What remains of his work? The mathematical contributions are real. His preface to Euclid's Elements genuinely influenced the development of English mathematics. His navigation techniques actually worked. Ships found their way to new worlds using methods he had helped develop. The concept of a British Empire, a term he coined, became reality. Though not in ways he would have recognised or necessarily approved, the mystical work is harder to assess. The Enochian language that Kelly claimed to receive from angels has had a strange afterlife. It's been studied, analysed, used in various magical systems, incorporated into fiction and games. Whether it's actually angelic communication or an elaborate constructed language remains debated. The structure is complex enough that it doesn't seem like simple fraud, but that doesn't prove supernatural origin. The manuscripts survive in scattered collections. The British Library holds some, the Bodleian has others. The obsidian mirror is in the British Museum, displayed as an artefact of Renaissance magic. Tourists walk past it without knowing the hours Dee spent staring into its black surface, waiting for angels to appear. His influence on later thinkers is difficult to trace because it's often indirect. Isaac Newton owned and studied Dee's alchemical manuscripts. The early members of the Royal Society were aware of his work. Elias Ashmole, who founded the Ashmolean Museum, collected Dee materials, but none of them could publicly acknowledge how much they were drawing on someone who had been labelled a conjurer. The British Empire that Dee envisioned did emerge, but the intellectual framework that was supposed to guide it, the Christian imperialism based on ancient wisdom and mathematical precision, never materialised. Instead, the empire was built on commerce, military force, and pragmatic politics. The mystical justifications were replaced by racial theories and economic arguments. Dee would have been appalled. Modern occultism has made Dee a central figure, sometimes elevating him to near mythical status. Aleister Crowley claimed to be continuing Dee's work. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn incorporated Enochian magic into their system. Contemporary chaos magicians use techniques supposedly derived from Dee's methods. He's become a founding figure in Western esoteric tradition, though what that tradition has made of his work would probably perplex him. What actually matters about John Dee isn't whether his angels were real or whether his mathematics was original. What matters is that he represents a moment when it was still possible to believe in comprehensive understanding, when the different ways of knowing the world hadn't yet been forced into separate, non-communicating disciplines. We've gained a lot from specialization. The division of knowledge into distinct fields has produced extraordinary advances in every domain. We know vastly more than Dee did about mathematics, astronomy, navigation, chemistry, history, languages. The scientific method works better than attempting to learn everything through mystical revelation. But we've also lost something. We've lost the sense that it all connects, that the person studying the stars and the person studying scripture and the person calculating navigation routes might all be working on the same fundamental questions. We've gained precision at the cost of vision. Dee's failure was inevitable. The unified understanding he sought was never going to happen, not because it wasn't noble or important, but because reality is too complex for any single mind to comprehend completely. The specialization he resisted was necessary for progress, yet his aspiration was genuine. He really believed that everything connected, that mathematics could reveal divine order, that careful observation could discover celestial patterns, that angels might communicate systematic knowledge to properly prepared seekers. He was wrong about the methods, but perhaps not entirely wrong about the goal. The world has fragmented in ways that sometimes trouble us. Scientists and humanists rarely speak to each other. Religious thinking and empirical investigation operate in separate spheres. The arts and sciences have become different cultures with different languages and different standards of truth. We've accepted these divisions as necessary and probably irreversible. Every so often, someone tries to bridge the gaps. They write books about the connections between physics and philosophy, or neuroscience and consciousness, or mathematics and meaning. These attempts are usually dismissed by specialists as superficial, as amateur dabbling in complex fields that require years of training to understand properly. The specialists are often right, but the impulse remains, the desire to see connections, to understand how everything fits together, to find meaning in the patterns. This doesn't disappear just because it's impractical or impossible. It's the same impulse that drove John Dee to fill his library with every kind of book, to study every available discipline, to seek unified knowledge through both calculation and revelation. That's his real legacy, not the navigation techniques or the empire or the angel conversations, but the demonstration that wanting comprehensive understanding is human even when achieving it isn't possible. His life proves that the aspiration itself has value, that trying to see the whole picture matters even when you fail, that the unity he sought might be worth pursuing even if it can never be fully grasped. Dee spent his final years in Manchester, far from court, far from his library, far from the conversations with angels that had consumed his middle age. He was warden of Christ's College, a minor administrative position that carried some income but little prestige. He performed his duties, settled disputes, managed properties. He wrote letters to patrons asking for support that rarely came. In those final years, did he regret the choices that had led him there? Did he wish he'd stayed with pure mathematics, avoided the dangerous conversations with spirits, kept his reputation intact? Or did he still believe that everything he'd done was necessary, that the unified knowledge he'd sought was real, even if he'd failed to achieve it? We don't know. He left no final statement explaining what he thought it had all meant. He just faded away, an old man in Manchester, remembered by some as a scholar, by others as a conjurer, understood by almost no one. But here's what we do know. He never stopped trying. Even in Manchester, even in poverty, even after everything had fallen apart, he continued working on his manuscripts, continued trying to make sense of what the angels had supposedly revealed, continued believing that comprehensive understanding was possible. That persistence might be the most important thing about him. Not whether he succeeded, but that he never accepted the fragmentation that was already beginning to define the modern world. He kept insisting that everything connected, that unity was real, that understanding was achievable if you just worked hard enough and approached it the right way. The world proved him wrong. The specialization he resisted became universal. The unity he sought dissolved into separate disciplines that barely acknowledge each other's existence. But 4 centuries later, we're still occasionally troubled by the same questions that troubled him. Still wondering if we've lost something important in the division, still wishing sometimes that someone could show us how it all fits together. Nobody can. The comprehensive understanding Dee sought remains out of reach, but the fact that he tried, that he spent his life pursuing it despite all the obstacles and failures and ridicule, that suggests something about what it means to be human. We want to understand everything. We want it all to make sense. We want unity even when reality offers only fragments. John Dee died trying to achieve something impossible, but trying might be the point. The pursuit itself might matter more than success or failure. His life demonstrates that aspiring to comprehensive understanding is worthwhile even when the aspiration can't be fulfilled, that the attempt to see connections, and find patterns and discover meaning is fundamentally human, regardless of whether it succeeds. That's why his story still resonates. Not because he achieved what he sought, but because he sought it at all. Because he refused to accept that knowledge should be divided, that understanding should be limited, that some questions couldn't be asked just because the answers seemed impossible to find. He tried anyway. And in trying, he showed us something about ourselves, about the human need for comprehensive understanding that persists regardless of how impractical or impossible it might be. We live in a world John Dee helped create without meaning to. Every time a ship navigates by mathematics instead of intuition, that's his legacy. Every time someone argues that knowledge should be accessible rather than locked in universities, that's his influence. Every time England's imperial history gets examined, his fingerprints are there in the original vision of maritime dominance. But we've forgotten him in the ways he'd actually recognise. The unified understanding he sought, the comprehensive vision that connected mathematics to mysticism, navigation to angels, careful observation to divine revelation, that's gone. We carved up his life's work the same way we carved up knowledge itself, took the useful parts, filed away the embarrassing parts, created a version of him that fits our categories. The real John Dee doesn't fit. He was trying to hold together things that were already pulling apart, trying to preserve a way of thinking about reality that was becoming obsolete even as he pursued it. The world moved past him not because he was wrong exactly, but because the framework he operated within couldn't survive contact with the new methods emerging in natural philosophy. His mathematical work influenced people who never knew his name. The British Empire he envisioned became reality through people who would have been horrified to be associated with a conjurer. The navigation techniques spread while the mystical justifications were quietly dropped. Ideas escaped their source, transformed into something their originator wouldn't recognise. That's how influence actually works, not through direct acknowledgement or clear lines of transmission, but through fragments that get incorporated into other projects, through concepts that become so common nobody remembers where they came from, through visions that shape reality even when the visionary gets forgotten.